I was born in Picenum, far from the marble grandeur of Rome, yet the city's shadow fell across my cradle long before I first saw its walls. My father, Pompeius Strabo, was a man feared more than he was loved, a consul who had carved his name with cruelty and coin. He taught me early that reputation in Rome was not built on virtue, but on how well others feared you. I was his heir, not to his estates, but to his ambition. And ambition in Rome was a thing sharpened by betrayal. I was young when I first walked the streets of the capital, the stink of smoke and sweat clinging to the air, the forums echoing with the cries of merchants, lawyers, and beggars. To me, Rome was not a city. It was a beast, vast and hungry, feeding on the flesh of men and spitting out their bones. And like all beasts, it could be tamed only by those willing to strike it harder than it struck them. I watched senators in their white togas, faces solemn with virtue, while their hands reached for bribes. I watched matrons wrapped in jewels speak of chastity, while sneaking glances at the young men who passed. Hypocrisy was Rome's true language, and I learned it fluently. As a boy, I was expected to sit quietly during banquets, to observe as my elders drank and boasted. But I listened, and what I heard was not the rhetoric of honor. I heard men laugh about the women they had traded like cattle in the name of alliances. I heard whispers of generals who paraded captives not only in triumphs, but in their private chambers. I heard how accusations of lust and perversion could ruin a man quickly than defeat on the battlefield. It was at those tables that I understood. In Rome, power was not only in the sword or the treasury. It was in the bedchamber, in rumor, in the way one's private life could be sharpened into a weapon by a rival's tongue. My father died when I was 17, leaving me young, untested, but already despised by those who had suffered under his cruelty. Many thought I would fall quickly, that without him I would be crushed by enemies eager to erase his line, but I had learned enough to survive. I gathered my father's veterans, men loyal not to Rome, but to their purses, and I bought their swords with promises of plunder. At an age when most still learn their letters, I commanded armies. Blood became the ink with which I wrote my name, and Rome began to read it. Yet even as I marched with soldiers, even as I seized lands and titles, I knew the truth. No legion, however loyal, could shield me from scandal. Rome's nobility would never welcome me unless I wrapped myself in their silk. I needed to marry well, to forge bonds that even my enemies could not easily sever. And so, I learned the other battlefield of Rome, marriage. Marriage in my world was not the joining of hearts, but the chaining of families. A daughter was not a child, but a contract. A wife was not a companion, but a bridge to power. My first marriage was arranged when I was scarcely more than a boy. Our Emilia, young and of noble birth, was promised to me, though she was already another man's wife. But promises meant nothing in Rome. The Senate ordered her divorce, and she was thrust into my bed before the sheets of her first marriage had grown cold. She died soon after, carrying my child, 2 others. It was tragedy. To me, it was lesson. Even in death, women were tools of men's ambition, their bodies the battlegrounds, where legacies were won or lost. I was called Magnus, the Great, long before I had earned the name. Sulla, the dictator, flattered me so, and I accepted it with a smile, though I knew it chained me to expectations. To be Magnus was to be more than victorious in war. It was to appear flawless, to embody Roman virtue, while practicing Roman vice in the shadows. I began to wear the mask early, and I wore it well. In public I paraded discipline and piety. In private I learned that feasts were not merely about food, but about spectacle, that a general must know how to entertain as well as conquer, that excess could bind men as tightly as fear. I watched how cups of wine loosened tongues, how dancers at banquets could make senators reveal more than they should, how a whispered joke about a rival's appetite, for food or for flesh, could spread like fire through the city. The boy I was faded quickly into the man Rome demanded. My victories brought me wealth, My wealth bought me loyalty, and loyalty secured my place in the Senate. Yet I knew even then that none of it was permanent. Today's ally was tomorrow's accuser. Today's victory was tomorrow's scandal. I had seen men destroyed, not on the battlefield, but in whispers, accused of sleeping with boys, with slaves, with their own kin. Whether true or not mattered little. Reputation in Rome was clay in the hands of enemies, shaped to whatever form they desired. I swore I would never let them mold mine. I would be the one to shape theirs, and so, my life became a balancing act, the general adored by his legions, the statesman admired by the people, the husband who married well, the guest who feasted lavishly yet never too much, the Roman who embodied virtue even as I stood knee-deep in vice. This was my Rome, a city where sex was currency, marriage a weapon, and rumor a sword. And from the beginning, I understood that to survive, I would have to wield them all. History would later call me Pompey the Great, but in truth, I was Pompey the Watcher, Pompey the Learner, Pompey the Mask, and if I became Magnus, it was not because I was greater than others. It was because I knew their secrets, and I knew how to keep mine hidden, at least, for a time. Marriage, the word should mean love, companionship, perhaps even peace in a world ruled by war. But in Rome, marriage was no such thing. Marriage was a battlefield, bloodless yet brutal, where daughters were traded like coin, and wives were pawns sacrificed to secure alliances. I learned this early, and I played the game as well as any man who wished to rise. My first marriage, to our Amelia, had already taught me that women's lives mattered less than a Senate decree. She was another man's wife, given to me because Sulla demanded it. Her body shifted like land on a map. She was torn from her husband, wedded to me, and died soon after, carrying my child. To the city, her death was nothing more than a passing whisper. To me, it was proof that marriages in Rome were contracts written not in ink, but in flesh and blood. After our Amelia came Mucia Tertia, a woman of noble stock, connected to the powerful Scipionic line. To wed her was to weld myself to one of the oldest families in Rome. For a time, it seemed a triumph. With Mucia, I bore children who lived, and for a while I thought I had secured both legacy and stability. But Rome never allowed stability to endure. Soon rumors began to coil around my name, Moke. Whispers that she had been unfaithful, whispers that I had been cuckolded by none other than Julius Caesar himself. Whether true or not, it scarcely mattered. Rumor in Rome was as good as fact. And so, I divorced her, publicly severing the bond. For in politics the appearance of weakness is worse than the wound itself. She left, my children remained, and I stood once more alone, watching my private life become fodder for the gaping mouths of Rome. Yet even betrayal can be reshaped into opportunity. Caesar and I had circled one another warily 4 years, both aware that Rome was too small to contain us both. But the triumvirate, that uneasy alliance between myself, Caesar, and Crassus, all needed to be forged, and it would not be forged with words alone. And so, Caesar offered me his daughter, Julia. Julia was young, far younger than I, but she was gentle, beautiful, and untainted by the cynicism of Rome. She was the opposite of all I had known, a wife not just given as a pawn, but one who looked at me not as a transaction, but as a man. Against my will, against all reason, I grew to care for her. For the first time, I felt what others claimed marriage was meant to be: companionship, laughter, even love. My enemies mocked me for it, saying I grew soft under her gaze, that I forgot the steel required of a man in my position. Perhaps they were right, but for a brief moment, I allowed myself the luxury of being human, and then Rome took her from me. She died in childbirth, along with the child who might have bound our families forever. I buried her with my own hands, though generals are not meant to weep. With her death, not only did I lose the only woman who had ever softened my heart, but the bond with Caesar began to unravel. Our alliance was more than political. It had been sealed in blood and in bed. Without her, the thread snapped, and we became rivals once more. Rome always demanded sacrifice, and in my case, it demanded wives. Each marriage I entered was less about love than about survival. Each divorce or death was not a private wound, but a public weapon, used by my enemies to weaken me. Where another man might have carried scars in silence, mine were paraded in the forums, discussed in taverns, whispered in Senate halls. My household was not my own. It was a stage upon which Rome itself played. Yet I cannot deny that I, too, played the game. I used wives as shields, alliances as daggers, children as pawns in my climb. Was I crueler than others? No, but I was no gentler either. In Rome, cruelty and pragmatism were the same thing. We masked it with words like duty and honor, but underneath lay the truth. Women were the currency of men's ambitions, their fates as negotiable as the terms of a treaty. When I reflect upon my marriages, I see not joy but patterns. Each wife brought me closer to power. Each divorce or death stripped something from me. Our Aemilia tied me to Sulla, Mucia tied me to the Scipios, Julia tied me to Caesar, and in the end, each tie was severed, leaving me more isolated, more exposed, until nothing remained but myself and the enemies closing in. There are those who say my downfall began on the battlefield, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched upon Rome. They are wrong. My downfall began in the marriage bed, when alliances built on flesh dissolved in blood. Rome's true wars were not always fought with legions. They were fought with daughters, with whispers, with scandal. And I, Pompey the Great, was both warrior and victim in that endless war. Marriage was the most horrifying practice of all, for it was a war where the battlefield was the body, where the casualties were women and children, where victory was always temporary, and betrayal was inevitable. If I am to confess the truth of my life, it is this: I was a master of armies, but in the war of marriage, Rome mastered me. If the battlefield was where a Roman general proved his courage, the banquet hall was where he proved his power. To the people of Rome, feasts were not merely gatherings of food and laughter. They were stages upon which men displayed wealth, alliances, and dominance. A single evening at table could raise a man's reputation higher than a year in the Senate, or destroy it more completely than a defeat in war. I learned this early. My father had hosted banquets where soldiers and senators alike were plied with wine until they slurred promises they could never take back. As his son, I watched from the side of the hall, silent, unseen, absorbing the lesson that appetite was not weakness, but weapon. To control a man's hunger, for food, for drink, for flesh, was to control the man himself. When I became Magnus, the Great, Rome expected me to prove the title was only in triumphs, but at table. And so I did. My feasts were spoken of across the city. Tables laden with roasted boar, peacocks with their feathers repinned for display, bowls of exotic fruits brought from the farthest edges of empire. But make no mistake, the food was never the point. The point was who sat where, who poured whose cup, who laughed at whose jest. A banquet was a map of Rome's politics, written in wine stains and crumbs. Senators competed to be invited, for an absence could be taken as insult. Generals brought their wives dressed in silks, hoping my gaze might linger. For to be noticed by Pompey was to be given a chance at favor. Poets recited verses, some praising my victories, others mocking my rivals. And always, behind the laughter, I listened. Loose tongues betrayed secrets, and I, who held my wine better than most, gathered them like coins dropped carelessly beneath the table. But Rome's banquets were not only about boasting, they were about humiliation. I saw it done, and I admit, I did it myself. A man seated too far from the host was marked as unimportant. A dish denied was an insult sharper than a dagger. To force a rival to drink beyond his capacity, to make him stumble, to coax him into foolish speech before witnesses. This was warfare waged with goblets instead of swords. There were darker moments too. Rome had little mercy for those of lower station, and feasts often became arenas of cruelty disguised as entertainment. Slaves were ordered to dance, to fight, sometimes to endure punishments for the amusement of guests. Women, both slaves and freed, were paraded as prizes of conquest, their humiliation passed off as spectacle. Men cheered as though it were theatre, but I knew the truth. Such displays reminded all present of Rome's hierarchy. Power was measured by how many others could be degraded at your command. I confess I participated. How could I not? To refuse would have been to seem weak, to risk ridicule. I ordered wine poured until rivals faltered. I demanded songs sung until voices cracked. I allowed the games to continue, though sometimes I turned my eyes away. It was said I was more restrained than others, less debauched than Lucullus, less extravagant than Crassus, less shameless than Caesar, perhaps, but restraint in Rome was relative. Even moderation dripped with excess compared to the lives of the people outside those gilded halls, and yet the feasts were traps. To host was to risk envy. To attend was to risk scandal. I recall one evening at Lucullus's villa, where the wealth of the East was displayed in dishes, so rich they shamed even my table. Word spread quickly, whispers that he wasted fortunes, that his hunger for luxury outstripped his victories in war. The people mocked him as more cook than commander. His banquets, meant to glorify him, instead reduced him to satire. I remembered that lesson well. Rome loved spectacle, but it hated the man who reminded them too clearly of his superiority. Thus I walked a narrow path. My banquets were grand, but not too grand, lavish, but not obscene. I gave just enough excess to inspire awe, but not enough to provoke disgust. It was a balancing act, one I maintained 4 years. And still, I knew every feast carried risk. A spilled goblet, a misplaced word, a careless jest. Any of these could be seized upon by rivals and twisted into scandal. What horrified me most was not the excess itself, but the ease with which we accepted it. Men who in the forum declaimed about virtue and discipline became beasts in the banquet hall. Senators who thundered against corruption in daylight gorged themselves on bribery by night. Even I, Pompey the Great, found myself playing the part, smiling as men debased themselves for my favor, laughing at cruelty I did not enjoy, but did not stop. The banquet hall revealed Rome's true face, and it was uglier than any battlefield. And yet, these gatherings mattered. Alliances were forged in the clink of goblets. Wars were plotted over roasted meats. Betrayals were whispered behind veils of smoke and laughter. I secured support for campaigns in Spain and the East not through speeches, but through evenings of wine where senators left my table too intoxicated to remember which promises they had given. Only that they owed me something. If you ask me where Rome's greatest horrors lay, in the arena, in the brothel, in the Senate, I would answer, in the banquet hall. For here, beneath chandeliers of oil lamps and amid the stench of spiced wine, Rome revealed its soul. And it was not noble, nor virtuous, nor restrained. It was ravenous. In my life I fought battles that stained rivers red, commanded armies that shook the earth. And yet I sometimes think the true wars of Rome were fought at those tables. Wars of humiliation, of appetite, of whispered slander. Wars that left no monuments, but destroyed reputations, marriages, and families all the same. I, Pompey, played that war. I won often. I lost sometimes. And in the end, perhaps it was not the battlefield nor the Senate that sealed my fate, but the slow poison of Rome's feasts, the endless hunger for more, the gnawing envy of those who watched, the rumors that festered in the shadows once the candles guttered out. War was the breath of Rome, and conquest its heartbeat. Every general knew that glory was measured not only in the land seized or the enemies slain, but in the wealth and bodies dragged back in chains. I was no different. My name, Magnus the Great, was carved into history just by victories, but by the endless columns of captives I paraded through Rome's streets. Slavery was the foundation upon which our world stood. To us, It was not questioned. It was assumed, like the rising of the sun or the flowing of the Tiber. But behind that assumption lay horrors that even now, in the twilight of my life, gnaw at me like wolves at a corpse. For every victory I claimed, thousands suffered in silence, stripped not only of freedom, but of dignity, of humanity itself. When I marched in triumph, the people of Rome cheered the treasures, gold from Spain, jewels from the East, spices from Africa. Yet it was not the gold that fed Rome. It was the slaves. Men to till the fields, women to bear burdens, and children. Always children, they were the true spoils of war. We generals dressed it in fine words, booty, tribute, prisoners of conquest. But what we truly paraded were broken lights. I remember Spain, where Sertorius fought like a fox and bled my legions with cunning. When at last we broke his resistance, the villages surrendered by the dozens. I gave orders, some executed, others enslaved. The men were bound, the women separated, the children herded together like livestock. They wept, screamed, begged in tongues I barely understood. And I, Pompey the Great, ordered their transport. It was efficient, necessary, expected. And yet, when night fell, I could not silence their cries. They echo still. In the east, after my wars against Mithridates and the pirates, the numbers swelled beyond count. It is said I captured more than 100,000 souls in those campaigns. The pirates, who once terrorized the seas, I crushed with swift force. Those who surrendered I resettled in Cilicia, but many others, their wives and children, were auctioned in Rome within months. The markets overflowed, buyers swarming like vultures, prices driven down, because there were too many bodies to sell. Imagine it. So many captives that the value of human life itself dropped as though it were grain in surplus. That was my doing. That was my triumph. Slaves filled every corner of Rome's life. In the fields, they bent beneath the sun. In kitchens, they cooked the feasts that fed our excess. In bedrooms, they bore duties far darker, far more humiliating. Rome's elite believed possession of bodies proved possession of power. To own someone was to demonstrate superiority, and ownership knew no boundaries. Young boys and girls, men and women, their worth was reduced to what pleasure or labor they could provide. Consent did not exist. Dignity was a luxury reserved for the free. I will not pretend innocence. As general, I allowed it. As Roman, I benefited from it. The triumphs that earned me my title Magnus were steeped in the suffering of slaves. I walked in parades, while they stumbled behind me in chains. I dined in marble halls built by their backs. My wives wore jewels purchased with their bodies. It was Rome's way, but was it not also Rome's curse? One think often of the women. For them, conquest meant not only exile from their homes, but violation in ways that cannot be undone. Taken first by soldiers as spoils, then by masters as property, their lives became an ending submission. Rome congratulated itself on its discipline, on the virtues of its generals, yet turned blind eyes to the suffering within its own walls. The very Senate that debated laws of marriage and chastity filled its villas with slaves forced into beds against their will. Hypocrisy was not the exception in Rome. It was the rule. What horrifies me most now is not that it happened, but how normal it was. No one questioned it. No one saw the chains as unnatural. The laughter of children playing in patrician gardens often rang out beside the sobs of enslaved children who had been torn from their mothers. And yet, the laughter drowned the sobs, for Romans preferred not to hear. We called ourselves civilized, masters of the world, yet we built that civilization on degradation so profound it poisoned us all. I recall one banquet where a senator, drunk with wine, mocked another by reminding him that his household slaves were once noble daughters of Greece. Laughter shook the whole. The man flushed red but said nothing. That was humiliation in Rome, not the act of possessing, but being reminded of the origins of your possession. Such was the cruelty of our world. Cruelty I upheld. cruelty I profited from, cruelty that history will never forget. Even Julius Caesar, my great rival, was rumored to have whispered in bed with the wives of senators and the slaves of generals. Accusations flew that he was every man's woman in Rome, true or not. The insult reveals our city's sickness, that sexuality was a weapon, that rumors of degradation could ruin a reputation, as surely as any defeat. It was the same sickness that tainted me. Though in quieter ways, I did not escape it. No one did. In triumph, when I led captives through Rome, the crowd cheered me as a god. But what god was I? A man who had shattered homes, who had reduced free-born souls to nameless property, who had filled the markets with flesh and called it victory. My greatness was not carved from marble or gold. It was carved from the suffering of those who had no voice. And yet, I tell you this, slavery was not merely Rome's practice, it was Rome's soul. Without it, we could not have fed our armies, built our temples, or filled our coffers. Without it, I would not have been Pompey the Great. That is the truth, as horrifying as any battlefield massacre. I confess, then, that my conquests were never mine alone. They belonged also to those who carried the weight of chains. Their blood watered the roots of Rome's empire. Their tears mortared the stones of our palaces. Their bodies were consumed in our endless hunger for power. And if my legacy is to be told honestly, it must be told with theirs. For I, Pompey, was not only a general of legions, I was a general of chains. And though Rome may still call me Magnus, I know the truth. Greatness built upon suffering is nothing more than a monument to horror. In Rome, a sword could cut down a man's body, but a whisper could cut down his soul. We Romans understood this better than any people before or since. Rumor was not idle talk, it was war. And in that war, sex was our sharpest blade. I learned quickly that no general, no senator, no consul was immune to the poison of slander. A man's victories could be forgotten in an instant if the city believed he was weak in the bedchamber. And so our rivals struck not at our armies, but at our reputations. They mocked our appetites, invented perversions, spread stories of humiliation until the marketplace buzzed louder than the Senate floor. I was no exception. When I divorced Mutia Tertia, whispers sprang like weeds. They said she had been unfaithful. They said Julius Caesar himself had been her lover. Perhaps it was true, perhaps it was not. In Rome, truth mattered little. What mattered was that men believed it. Pompey, cuckold of Caesar, they called me in the taverns, their laughter spilling into the streets. My enemies smirked in the Senate, their words sharp with insinuation. Even my allies questioned whether I could command Rome if I could not command my own wife. It was not only me. Caesar himself was branded with every insult imaginable. They said he had lain with Gnaeus, king of Bithynia, as a youth, that he had sold his body for favor, that he was the queen of Bithynia rather than a Roman man. His rivals jeered that he was every man's wife in Rome, and every woman's husband. Whether it was true did not matter. What mattered was the image, Caesar as effeminate, Caesar as submissive, Caesar as weak. He endured it, even laughed at it in public, but I know it gnawed at him. That is why, I think, he fought all the harder to dominate every arena of Rome, the forum, the battlefield, the bed. This was our sickness, Rome, which prided itself on virtue, on discipline, wielded accusations of vice more savagely than any sword. A man could be honorable in all things, but one rumor of indulgence, one suggestion of submission, and his career could be ended. We equated sexual dominance with political dominance. To be accused of weakness in one was to be branded weak in all. I confess, I too wielded this weapon. Against my enemies I whispered of their indulgences, their mistresses, their slaves. I hinted that rivals neglected their duties in pursuit of pleasure. I allowed stories to spread unchecked if they weakened those who stood against me. It was the way of Rome. If you did not strike first, you would be struck down. The hypocrisy was staggering. Our feasts overflowed with excess. Our temples reeked of incense, offered by men who kept concubines in secret. Our senators demanded chastity from their wives while bedding their slaves. And yet, these same men thundered against corruption in public, condemning those accused of the very sins they themselves practiced in silence. I was no different. None of us were. I remember vividly the day Cicero, sharp-tongued and venomous, mocked me in the Senate. He said my power rested not on virtue, but on borrowed alliances. He hinted that I was softened by my young wife Julia, that I was ruled by her beauty rather than my own strength. The chamber laughed, not because they believed it, but because humiliation was more delicious to them than truth. I stood silent, my fists clenched, knowing that to protest would only confirm the jest. That was the trap of slander. Silence was guilt, denial was guilt, laughter was guilt. Once the rumor took root, no man could tear it out. It horrifies me still, how we used women as weapons in this war of whispers. A man's honor could be destroyed by claiming his wife was unfaithful, whether she was or not. A woman's worth was measured only in the damage her reputation could inflict upon her husband. Julia's death was mourned, but even in mourning I heard whispers. Some said I wept too much, that I had grown weak, that grief had unnanned me. Even love itself was twisted into slander. And so, I wore my mask more tightly. I played the part of the stoic general, the unyielding statesman, while beneath the mask I felt the poison seep. Every rumor, every laugh, every whispered jest was a cut. One cut alone is nothing, but 1,000 cuts will bleed a man dry. Rome was a city built on betrayal, and betrayal needed no sword. It needed only a whisper. I, Pompey, who commanded legions, who shattered kings, who paraded captives by the tens of thousands, was undone more often by slander than by steel. If you ask me the most horrifying practice of Rome, it was not merely slavery, nor the banquets of excess. It was the way we devoured one another with lies, the way we weaponized lust and shame, the way we reduced lives and marriages to jokes whispered in smoky halls. Rome prided itself on being the most powerful city in the world. But in truth, we were the most fearful of rumor, fearful of laughter, fearful that behind the mask of greatness, others might glimpse our weakness. And perhaps that is why my story ends not in triumph, but in betrayal. For in Rome, no man's reputation survived forever. Not even Pompey the Great. Rome loved to clothe its vices in the garments of virtue. No city spoke more of morality while practicing less of it. We thundered in the forum about Mons Myrum, the sacred customs of our ancestors, while in the shadows we twisted those very customs to suit our appetites. And nowhere was this hypocrisy more evident than in how we mingled the sacred with the profane. I remember standing in the Senate as laws were proposed to strengthen marriage and chastity. Augustus would later make them infamous, but even in my time, men pressed for restrictions on adultery, penalties for immorality, rewards for women who bore children. All sounded noble, Rome guarding its virtue, protecting its families. But I knew, as did every man seated beside me, that those same senators returned home to households filled with concubines and slaves, to wives they married for alliance, not love, to beds that saw far more politics than piety. I myself was no stranger to this duplicity. In public I paraded as the model Roman, pious in sacrifice, devout in ritual, generous to the temples. I built theatres, restored shrines, placed garlands at the feet of gods, and Rome adored me for it. They cheered my devotion, whispered of my divine favor, hailed me as chosen by heaven. But in truth, my offerings were less prayers than bribes, bribes to the gods for victory, bribes to the people for loyalty. Religion was never about faith. It was about image. Even our rituals bled into corruption. Consider the sacred games, where athletes competed in honor of Jupiter, where priests intoned solemn prayers. Behind the palm lay feasts drenched in excess, senators wagering fortunes, slaves forced to perform degrading acts for amusement in the name of festival spirit, The gods may have been invoked, but the true deities worshipped were appetite and power. What horrified me most was how even the temples became theatres of exploitation. Vestal virgins, sworn to purity, were paraded as symbols of Rome's virtue, yet their every movement was watched by men eager for scandal. A rumour of impropriety could lead to their execution, not because Rome cared for chastity, but because such deaths served as spectacle, proof that even sacred women could be crushed for the Republic's image. We claimed to worship the divine. In truth, we worshipped control. My own marriages were wrapped in this sacred profane contradiction. The augurs blessed each union. Sacrifices were made, vows spoken before gods. But what god blessed Julia's death in childbirth? What god sanctified the ripping of our Amelia from her first husband's arms so she could be thrust into mine? No, these were not holy acts. They were political bargains cloaked in divine approval. Rome invoked the gods not to guide us, but to excuse us. Even in victory, the sacred was profaned. When I celebrated my great triumph over the East, I walked through the streets with incense burning, priests chanting, and golden statues glittering in the sunlight. Behind me marched captives from lands where other gods were worshipped. Rome jeered their faiths, mocked their rituals, enslaved their priests. And yet, in our arrogance, we claimed to honor the divine. I, Pompey, paraded their holy relics as trophies of conquest. Their gods were not defeated, only desecrated. But Rome told itself that our gods had proven stronger, that Jupiter had triumphed. What hypocrisy! We used religion as a mask for greed. I recall vividly one campaign where my men raided a temple in Asia Minor. They dragged out sacred vessels, stripped gold from altars, and brought them to me as spoils. I was praised for enriching Rome. No one asked about the faithful who had wept as their gods were defiled. No one questioned whether we had committed sacrilege. In Rome, victory sanctified all acts. The line between sacred and profane was not simply blurred. It was erased. This hypocrisy extended to our laws. The Senate denounced excess, yet competed to outdo one another in extravagance. They declared fidelity the cornerstone of the Republic, yet winked at adultery when it served their interests. They punished women with severity, yet excused men with laughter. I saw husbands publicly drag wives into court for infidelity, while maintaining entire households of concubines themselves. The same city that executed Vestals for suspicion of impurity cheered generals who returned from war with entire harems of enslaved women. And I played my part. I bowed before the temples, offered sacrifices, invoked the gods in speeches. I allowed the people to believe was favored by heaven. But in my heart I knew Rome's gods were less divine beings than political tools. We sacrificed not to honor them, but to manipulate men. We built temples not to house their presence, but to display our wealth. The gods had become stage props, and religion was the backdrop upon which Rome acted out its endless play of ambition. If you ask me now what was Rome's greatest horror, I might answer this: that we used the sacred as a mask for the profane. We turned piety into performance, faith into weapon, devotion into theatre. We preached virtue while practicing vice, and we condemned the powerless for sins we ourselves committed daily. I, Pompey, confess it. I was among the worst. My triumphs were praised as gifts of the gods, my marriages sanctified by priests, my feasts blessed by augurs. Yet beneath it all lay corruption, betrayal, cruelty. And the people cheered, for they preferred illusion to truth. The Republic claimed to be founded on honor. In reality, it was founded on appetite, cloaked in the incense of temples and the hymns of priests. Rome's sacred was never more than a veil for Rome's profane. And in that veil, we hid our sins until they devoured us whole. Ambition is the sweetest poison in Rome. We sip it slowly at first, telling ourselves we drink for duty, for honor, for the Republic. But soon it burns through the veins, demanding more, always more. I, Pompey the Great, drank deeply of that poison, and for a time it lifted me higher than I could have imagined. But every poison leaves its mark, and ambition was no different. From the beginning, I had believed that my marriages, my alliances, my carefully constructed image would secure my place. With Julia, Caesar's daughter, I had not only an ally, but for once a wife I cherished. Her death broke more than my heart. It shattered the fragile peace of Rome. Without her, the rope binding Caesar and me frayed until it snapped. The triumvirate, that uneasy alliance of myself, Caesar, and Crassus, collapsed into dust, and ambition drove us each to sharpen our swords. I cannot blame Caesar alone. I too longed for supremacy. He had his victories in Gaul. I had mine in Spain and the East. Rome was not large enough to contain us both. And so the city became a chessboard, with senators, consuls, and soldiers as the pieces. The whispers of scandal, the rumors of betrayal, the marriages used as weapons, all of it had been but a prelude. Now, at last, the ambitions hidden in banquet halls and sealed in marriage beds erupted into open war. The Senate leaned toward me, or so I believed. They saw in Caesar a tyrant, a man too ambitious, too dangerous. But was I so different? I paraded as the defender of the Republic, but in truth, I too sought its crown. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, defying law and custom, it was more than a march. It was the unveiling of truth. The Republic had become a carcass, and we, the vultures, descended to feast. In those days, I often asked myself, what had brought us here? Was it my hunger for power, Caesar's? Or was it Rome itself, with its insatiable appetite for dominance? I remembered the slaves I had paraded, the feasts I had hosted, the alliances I had sealed with women's lives. All of it had been part of the same sickness, a city that consumed everything, even its own soul. In pursuit of greatness, the cost of ambition was not measured only in battles. It was measured in families torn apart, in loyalties broken, in the blood that stained the very stones of the Forum. Senators who had once feasted at my table fled to Caesar's side. Old allies betrayed me with the ease of men changing their togas. And I, who had thought myself master of rumor and manipulation, found my own reputation corroded by whispers I could not silence. They said I had grown soft, that Julia's death had unmanned me. They said my soldiers no longer loved me as they once had, that Caesar's brilliance outshone my own. They called me cautious, hesitant, fearful. And though I commanded legions, though I held Rome's official favor, I could not erase the doubt that gnawed at me. Ambition is a cruel master. It does not allow for weakness, and in those final years, I was weak. The horror was not only mine. I saw Rome herself unravel. Families divided, brothers taking opposite sides, fathers against sons. Blood that should have defended Rome spilled instead upon her fields. The Republic was no longer a city of laws, but a stage for civil war. And I, Pompey, was one of its architects. I had believed that by playing the game of alliances and betrayals, I could control Rome's destiny. Instead, I had only helped doom her. What ambition demanded of me was everything. My wives were pawns, my children bargaining chips, my soldiers sacrifices. I gave myself to the Republic, and in return it devoured me. That was the true cost. Rome offered no loyalty, no gratitude. She used men like me, lifted us high, then cast us down when she hungered for someone new. I often wonder what would have happened had Julia lived. Perhaps her presence might have kept Caesar and me bound, if not in friendship, at least in restraint. Perhaps the Republic might have endured a little longer. But such thoughts are useless. Rome was already rotting. Julia's death did not cause the collapse. It merely stripped away the last illusion of peace. In the end, the cost of ambition was not only my downfall, it was the downfall of the Republic itself, the very practices that had lifted us. The marriages arranged for power, the rumors wielded as weapons, the endless hunger for conquest. These became the instruments of our destruction. We could not stop drinking the poison, even as it consumed us. And so, As I reflect on those years, I see my life not as a tale of triumph, but as a caution. Pompey the Great, conqueror of Spain, breaker of pirates, defeater of Mithridates, yes, I was all those things. But I was also a man blinded by ambition, a man who sacrificed too much at the altar of Rome. My victories came at a cost I did not fully reckon until it was too late. The cost was Julia. The cost was the Republic. The cost was my own soul. When men speak of downfall, they imagine it as a single blow, swift and decisive. But downfall is slower, a long unraveling. By the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon, I should have seen the end approaching. I had the Senate, I had legions, I had the name Pompey Magnus. Yet name and legions mean little when fortune shifts her gaze. I fled Rome not as a conqueror, but as an exile. The streets that once roared with cheers for my triumphs now echoed with silence. The people I had fed, entertained, protected, turned their eyes to Caesar. He gave them spectacle. He gave them victories. He gave them promises. And I gave them nothing but fear of more war. In a city addicted to blood and glory, fear was no gift. At Pharsalus, my fate was sealed. My legions, once the envy of Rome, broke under Caesar's command. I remember the dust rising, the clash of steel, the cries of men who had followed me 4 decades. I stood on the field that day and felt something I had not known before, despair. For the first time, Pompey the Great was not master of fortune, but her plaything. Defeated, I fled again, this time to Egypt. I told myself I sought refuge, that King Ptolemy owed me loyalty, that here, in Alexandria, I could gather strength to fight anew. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was running from Caesar, and there was no safe place left in the world. Egypt was not sanctuary. It was a gamble, the final desperate move of a man who had once thought himself invincible. As my ship approached the Egyptian shore, I remember staring at the horizon, the sea stretching endlessly behind me, the land drawing closer. I thought of my youth in Picenum, of the fields where I had once played before ambition had claimed me. I thought of Julia, whose memory still pierced me like a blade. I thought of Rome, cruel, insatiable Rome, and wondered if she would even remember me once I was gone. Ptolemy's advisors met me with smiles. They spoke of friendship, of alliance, of shared interest. But I saw the calculation in their eyes. They weighed my worth not as a man, but as a coin. To shelter me would be to defy Caesar. To betray me would be to earn his favor. And in the scales of survival, betrayal weighed heavier. I was invited ashore. The beach stretched pale beneath the sun, the water lapping softly at the sand. I stepped into a small boat, leaving behind the safety of my ship. My men watched from the deck, their faces tense. Some urged me not to go, but pride, always pride, drove me forward. I told myself that a man of my stature could not refuse such an invitation. I was Pompey Magnus. Who would dare harm me? The answer came quickly. As I set foot on the sand, I was struck. A blade slid between my ribs, cold and merciless. There was no speech, no trial, no chance for dignity. The men who should have been my hosts became my executioners. My wife screamed from the ship. My soldiers shouted in horror. I fell into the surf, the salt stinging my wounds, the waves washing red with my blood. Thus ended Pompey the Great, not in battle, not in glory, but in betrayal on a foreign shore. They severed my head and offered it to Caesar as a gift. My head, once crowned with laurels in triumph, once bowed before the Senate, once kissed by Julia's gentle lips, reduced to a token in another man's game. Caesar wept when he saw it, or so they say. Perhaps he did. Or perhaps he laughed when the doors were shut. In Rome, even grief can be theatre, and so my life, built on victories, marriages, feasts, alliances, ended in humiliation. My greatness, Magnus, was a mask that cracked in the end. For what was I truly? A man who paraded captives in chains, who traded wives like treaties, who allowed feasts of cruelty, who wielded rumour like a dagger, and who was, at last, destroyed by the same betrayals he had once profited from. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this: Rome devours her own. No man, however mighty, escapes her hunger. I rose higher than most, but I fell as all do, fed to the jaws of ambition and treachery. I, Pompey the Great, confess this truth: my legacy is not only in the battles I won, but in the horrors I upheld. In the marriages I corrupted, the slaves I paraded, the feasts I sanctioned, the slanders I spread. And in the end, my own death was the mirror of my life, a betrayal dressed as friendship, a blade hidden in a smile. Greatness is an illusion. Rome teaches us this. And those who believe otherwise, as I once did, will learn the cost when the mask is torn away. Pompey the Great is remembered as one of Rome's giants, a general who rivaled Caesar, a man who held the fate of empires in his grasp. But behind the triumphs lay a darker truth: marriages used as weapons, slaves treated as trophies, rumors wielded as swords, and betrayals that consumed even him. His death in Egypt was not the fall of a man, but the revelation of what Rome truly was: a republic built on ambition, hypocrisy, and cruelty. To study Pompey is to see that greatness in Rome was always an illusion, and beneath it, horror.